there is this insistence that the reality of the situation be considered very profoundly under a set series of circumstances that I will undertake to regard as the moment whereto we identify ourselves in the current situation, which is altogether quite daunting as it is within the notion of any foregone conclusion that society and societies are have awakened to something that is part of not just part of the networking platforms themselves, but inside of the notion that we are alive, not only alive when we do extremely lofty and unprepared moments such as these, so as to execute the reality upon which we base all our concepts of self, the very concept of self, which I will note is very readily identifiable as a certain series of global events that have amassed the what how we how a person, a human being, a subject comes to realize the way they want to perform their lives with all these incredible restrictions, which are, interestingly enough, so much part of the which I've undertaken to make 2 decades or more worth of investigation into, which is German idealism. And it's not a way to really posit yourself as a being that is trying to realize yourself as an active agent of society under given restrictions that are administrative restrictions to try to prevent the spread of some sort of infectious disease that is such as we have here that collides with the psyche in a sense. So what you have is you have things quite binary between a physical infection and the restriction upon the mind, how one is able to realize themselves as a person with. We will say that I would like to suggest that between freedom and nature, in Kant's sense, the idea that we are more natural beings than creatures of free will is I think the way that we should approach life in this society. We should approach it as though we are creatures of nature, and that is the way to develop a natural process whereto we are able to access who we are as human beings, who one is as a human being in relation to the very elementary sort of communique between themselves and the ones in their inner within inner circles or distant places, such as remarkably we have the opportunity to examine here with anything um, so presumptuous as to make an example of an outlet whereto we are examining the concept of what it is to project a self beyond these limit points, these points of limitation, these restrictions, the essential idea that at each within a given time and space and certain coordinates, the periodicity of your being is limited and checked, and then enters into some sort of synthesis. you're constantly going through this process of mediation whereby you try to reify, that is, make concrete your own identity, your own self, and then from here you try to in a sense bypass the limitations themselves and the restrictions. And this is an unwieldy process. It's not recommended, but it's as a psychological way of making sure that you're not one is not mentally harmed by this. The human tendency is to try to bypass restrictions and try to execute free will. But it's likely that this is a very unwise decision, but it's more wise to think without restrictions than it is to live without restrictions and to live beyond the capacities offered you, your own faculties, your own means, and things of this nature. This is not recommended. Whereas the idea of trying to forcing oneself to not be completely inhibited within the self, but noticing the coordinates whereto there is a correspondence within the inner spectrum of reality. The places where you might situate yourself as I am here, but I am also there, and I am beyond. I am perhaps transcending this point of limitation. So, without even going into the virtual realm. So this is very much an experiment to attempt to bypass the virtual uh, limitation of sorts, to bypass virtual limitations. And that this is a very interesting concept, since I feel that it's quite, things are already quite virtual. Uh, in terms of the fact that if something is virtual, it means it has existence in something that is within the ether more than it does something that is outside of the ether. And I believe I am picking up some signals here. I had two viewers, which is very interesting. It's more than I'm used to. I'm used to having, at the very least, one ear, but if I have four ears, that is a very pleasant experience. And the world is such that the concept of a restriction being a loss of identity should never be considered a value point of argumentation. That one has lost when one has lost their identity when they are restricted. In fact, it is the possibility, the opportunity to express oneself within certain boundaries, within a certain closeness and an immediacy. It's this the suggestion that there be restrictions is something that creates that perhaps offers the possibility of the absence of mediation. So to live within the absence of mediation is to live within a situation whereby one is not one does not have to express oneself in such a way as it becomes universal to a large group of people. It can be sort of very singular, as Wittgenstein says. It's in Tractatus, with the notion that one person reads his book and he understands it, even though it is reflecting upon a world of facts, an individual understanding a world made up of facts. Even if one person fully grasps this reality, the reality that he has espoused, then it is valid. And I have one, so having one set of ears and eyes, perhaps in this particular instance, I would be willing to suggest that there might even be doctors that are perhaps insisting upon some sort of, wondering about the ethical boundaries around around what I am suggesting here, that doing something, proposing restrictions as a way of monitoring human activity as being part of the administrative uh, approach to making forms of knowledge more available to the public, to the a very closed informational network of public, individuated public uh, diplomats. In this case, I would have to say, luckily, I'm in the country of Canada, which means we are more diplomatic and less aggressive. We are always willing to make agreements, but also we will not. Canadians, of course, we I look forward to seeing uh, the the generality of this. Presuppose that my position is, you know, it's within something feasible, without ramifications. Essentially, it is a circumstantial scenario whereby and where to one is able to establish the notion of what pretext is, and in this very closed space that I suggest should be a closed space. It is amazing to have, at the very least, one occupant to this dwelling that is willing to participate with the notion that endless ramblings do not necessarily lack a position or have anything that instantiates the absence of meaning. For I feel that meaning is based upon presupposition that meaning exists, meaning itself exists, and where life seems very bleak and it seems very things seem very empty. If something is not popular, it is not. It doesn't seem to have meaning for certain individuals. If it's not popular, if it's not accepted by groups of people, it is, of course, not perhaps not unpopular, but I would say in one particular instance, the idea of something being popular, in order to be for something to be known, it has to be it can sometimes be very unpopular. For instance, someone will have a huge following that says extremely unpopular, inappropriate things and makes all sorts of comments that are grandiose and delusional and has an enormous following, whereas someone else is trying to make sense of a certain disorder and is perhaps saying things that are much less popular. So there's this essential bifurcation between populism and saying things that people are trying to establish. What is the pretext of this? Why is this person communicating in this way, which is a very random sort of elemental rubric, the an effort to establish a ground. In this particular instance, there is things are not entirely groundless, but they're within the spectrum of knowable, notwithstanding considerations of sort of a veritable communique of ideas that is have no real sort of start or finish. They are entirely sort of framed by the space in which the effort to avoid a restrictive process is an effort to open a space. But while something becomes virtual, it is actually closing the space. And I want to propose a new understanding of the concept of virtuality. And it's not really a new one. It's virtual. presentation is part of philosophy, and virtual presentation is something that means it is not necessarily spoken. It is certainly in the form of language, and it is certainly has visual representation to it, and and linguistic, some sort of language or communique between parties intersubjectively. But it's not, in this sense it's virtual, but in this sense it's unrestricted. Whereas a virtual, an actual sort of network, such as the such as we have here, is a different form of virtual representation. It imposes the same restrictions upon someone as are legal restrictions that are held by all knowable institutions. And I think that knowing oneself to be within a virtual representation that is an inward glimpse into a finite representation, but yet in some sort of infinite, regresses from the point in time where the telos of being goes out to the other, or goes out to someone at the other end of the playing field. You have, in this sense, you have something quite virtual. And the notion is to marry the concept of virtual representation to the virtual realm whereby people express the medium itself. In this sense, the very sort of McLuhan ideas, I don't want to necessarily bring McLuhan into it, but that things are sitting on top of, they're not necessarily on top of the medium, but they're nor within it, quite frankly. The same restrictions, we're bound by the same legal principles in a virtual, such things such as this, such as streaming or a podcast, are bound by the same restrictions as the restrictions imposed upon people trying to go to find a parking spot and go to a store and wear a mask and things of this nature. It's very restricted in terms of the way someone communicates. So to propose the idea that thinking, outside of these confines is a way to sort of transcend, is one way to possibly get yourself into some kind of state of worry about what's happening and what is to come, and things of this nature. With the monitoring process, some coherence there is quite necessary. And that being said, this coherence is beyond necessary. This coherence is of identifying a place where you semiotically you can't reach in to the screen and go. You can't jump through the mirror. What you have is you're looking at yourself, but you're also looking at the virtual existence beyond it. And that is the only way to really ground one's real world, is to say that this is without getting too specific about the idea that one must plan and order events as such within these checkpoints, these limit points. You have to, I think, someone that's trying to realize themselves at times such as these, realize I am this. People going to university and saying, I want to do this with the rest of my life, when you're looking at 5 to 10 years of everyone getting over the age in which we live. And everything, the thing is, everything for the last 20 to 30 years to 50 years has been building up to something like this, to I would say cutting that 100-year period between the Spanish flu and And what we have now is, looking at the 50-year period where you had sort of all sorts of civil unrest taking place in the midpoint, evolving into, a return to sort of dividing centuries in two sort of thing. So we have a certain amount of time to get our bearings uh, in the Western world, get our bearings with how to perform the remainder of how to set things up for the remainder of the decades to come. We have to ground reality in such a way as you're even though you're in this crisis, you have to you have to see outside of it so that you can plan for the next 50 years, to get, and in thinking that far ahead, you will be able to plan for, you know it may not be this most simple way to approach it, but it's certainly one way to look at the way to access the choices that must be made in order to identify reality as something very that can be concrete. If these virtual restrictions are checkpoints, similarly, and to but not checkpoints to the psyche, checkpoints only to the choices, the ability to be rational, and the time to get, sort of very dialectical is also part of rationality. Being dialectical and entering into discourse is part of rationality. It's all embodied in rationality, and that is why engaging in, sort of situations that are uncomfortable is, if it is approached but from the standpoint of a rational context, then it gives time for one moment to happen to the next, and that's what the idea of a restriction is it limits the dialectical potency that goes beyond, pinpoints the idea and tries to go beyond it to get to that point where the infinite regresses from the telos of where, from the other reality is, which is, in this case, it's, you want to escape the idea of a multitude of worlds, and you want to see the world as one place, and structured into discrete communities that all think in terms of the world. But you want to also see beyond the community, and that you don't want to just be completely sort of localized in your thinking, and you want to appropriate and learn and develop the way to conduct oneself based upon other regions and other contexts where certain things have happened. But as I can see, I have no comments here, so I am going to not to jump ship, but I'm going back to my chambers, as this is, I can see here from this that the sound may have been quite quiet. I hope not, but we shall see. But goodbye for now.